"Take the pretty one," her father said, but the Vampire King chose the rejected sister. The mahogany doors of the study slammed shut, trapping the scent of copper and expensive cologne in the stifling air. Richard shoved his youngest daughter forward, his hands trembling violently against her fragile, silk-draped shoulders. "Take the pretty one," he pleaded, his voice cracking as it echoed off the vaulted ceiling. "She's flawless. She's been groomed for this since she was a child. Take her, and my debt to the syndicate is wiped clean." Jeffrey, the apex predator in a bespoke charcoal suit, didn't even look at the trembling girl in silk. His midnight dark eyes bypassed the masterpiece entirely, settling instead on the shadowed corner of the room. He pointed a pale, ringed finger at the older sister wearing a faded wool sweater and scuffed boots. "No," Jeffrey said, his voice a low, melodic hum that vibrated in their teeth. "I want that one." 2 hours before the black motorcade carved its way up the winding gravel driveway of the estate, the house felt like a mausoleum waiting for its corpses. Madison knelt on the hardwood floor of the master bedroom, her mouth full of silver pins. She kept her head down, her calloused fingers working deftly to hem the bottom of Chloe's ivory silk slip dress. The fabric was unforgiving, catching on the rough patches of Madison's skin, a tactile reminder of the chasm between the two sisters. "It's too tight across the ribs," Chloe whispered, her voice barely audible over the relentless drumming of the October rain against the window panes. Her hands, perfectly manicured and trembling, clutched the edge of the antique vanity. "Breathe shallow," Madison instructed, pulling a pin from her lips and sliding it into the hem. She didn't look up. If she looked up, she would see the sheer, unadulterated terror in her sister's eyes. And Madison couldn't afford to feel anything right now. Someone had to keep the world spinning. Someone had to hold the crumbling foundation of the family together. For the last 3 years, that someone had been Madison. Their father, Richard, burst into the room without knocking. He smelled of scotch, stale sweat, and the sharp, metallic tang of absolute panic. He paced the length of the Persian rug, running a hand through his thinning grey hair. "Are you finished? They'll be here at sunset. They are always perfectly on time." Richard stopped pacing and stared at Chloe, his eyes manic, calculating. He reached out and aggressively pinched her pale cheek, trying to force a rush of blood to the skin. "You look like a ghost. Put on some rouge. You need to look alive. Vibrant. He needs to see that you are healthy." Chloe flinched, a silent tear spilling over her lashes and ruining the pristine line of her mascara. "Dad, please." "Don't cry," Richard snapped, his voice a sudden, violent crack in the quiet room. "If you cry, your eyes will swell. Do you want us all to die, Chloe? Is that what you want?" Madison rocked back on her heels, pushing herself up from the floor. Her knees popped in the quiet room. "Leave her alone, Dad. She's terrified." Richard turned his frantic gaze to Madison, his lip curling slightly. It was the same look he gave the outdated furniture they couldn't afford to replace, or the peeling wallpaper in the East Wing, a look of disdainful endurance. Madison wasn't ugly, but she lacked the ethereal, striking beauty of her younger sister. Madison was sharp angles, dark, unruly hair, and eyes that saw too much. She was practical. In a world where Richard traded on appearances, Madison was a bad investment. "Get out of those rags," Richard sneered, waving a dismissive hand at Madison's oversized wool sweater and faded denim. "Go to the kitchen. Make sure the staff has the silver polished. Jeffrey doesn't tolerate dust." Madison didn't argue. Arguing with a cornered animal was pointless. She turned and walked down the sweeping, unlit staircase. The electricity in the West Wing had been shut off 2 weeks ago. The money was gone. The cars were gone. The only thing left of value in the sprawling, mortgaged-to-the-hilt estate was Chloe. It was an open secret in their secluded, ultra-wealthy enclave. The old money families didn't talk about the syndicate. They didn't talk about the pale, impossibly wealthy men who ran the hedge funds and the shipping conglomerates. They certainly didn't talk about what happened when a family defaulted on a loan backed by the syndicate. You didn't pay with money. You paid in blood. Literally. Madison reached the kitchen just as the heavy iron gates at the bottom of the property shrieked open. The sound was a metallic scream that cut through the sound of the rain. She froze, her hand hovering over a tarnished silver tray. Through the kitchen window, the sweeping beams of halogen headlights pierced the gloom. 3 matte black Maybachs glided up the driveway, their engines making no sound, moving with the silent, predatory grace of sharks cutting through deep water. They were here. Madison wiped her hands on a dish towel, her heart hammering a frantic, painful rhythm against her ribs. She wasn't the currency. She wasn't the one being sold to the monsters to clear a ledger. Yet, as the heavy car doors opened in the rain, a profound, icy dread settled in her stomach. She walked toward the grand foyer, clinging to the shadows of the hallway. She just wanted to make sure Chloe didn't faint. She just wanted to be nearby. The heavy mahogany front door swung open before Richard could even reach it. The storm blew inside, scattering dead leaves across the marble tiles. And then the temperature in the house dropped. It wasn't a draft. It was a physical, unnatural cold that seeped into the marrow of Madison's bones. The king had arrived. He didn't look like a monster from the old Gothic stories. There were no fangs bared, no theatrical cape. Geoffrey stepped over the threshold, moving with a fluid, terrifying stillness. He wore a charcoal suit tailored so perfectly it looked like a second skin. His dark hair was slicked back, untouched by the storm outside. But it was his face that made Madison's breath hitch in her throat. It was a face of terrifying symmetry, carved from pale marble, utterly devoid of human warmth. His eyes, dark as an oil slick, swept over the foyer, cataloguing the chipped paint, the desperate father, and the scent of fear radiating from the humans. 4 massive men flanked him, their eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses despite the gloom. They radiated a heavy, suffocating violence. But Geoffrey was the eye of the storm. Complete, devastating calm. "Richard," Geoffrey said. The single word hung in the air, melodic, resonant, and utterly chilling. It sounded like a cello string snapping in a quiet room. "Mr. Vance," Richard stammered, his usual bluster collapsing instantly. He bowed, a pathetic, jerky motion. "Welcome to my home. Please come into the study. I have everything prepared. The arrangement is ready." Geoffrey didn't blink. He just stared at Richard for a long, agonizing moment before stepping forward. He didn't walk so much as he simply occupied a new space. The entourage followed, their heavy boots silent on the marble. Madison pressed her back against the cold plaster of the hallway, hidden in the dim light. She watched as her father ushered Geoffrey into the grand study. The doors remained cracked open, allowing a sliver of yellow light to spill onto the floor. "Bring her in," Richard hissed over his shoulder. A moment later, Chloe appeared at the top of the stairs. She looked breathtaking. The ivory silk clung to her curves, her blonde hair falling in perfect soft waves. She looked like an angel descending into a pit of vipers. She walked into the study, her head bowed, her hands clasped so tightly together her knuckles were stark white. Madison crept closer to the cracked door, holding her breath, unable to tear herself away from the horrific transaction. Inside the study, Geoffrey stood by the fireplace, though no fire was lit. He didn't offer to shake Richard's hand. He simply waited. Richard grabbed Chloe by the shoulders, his grip bruising, and shoved her forward into the center of the room. Chloe let out a tiny, stifled whimper. "Here she is," Richard said, his voice breathless, desperate. "My youngest. Chloe. Take the pretty one. She's flawless. She's been groomed for this since she was a child. A pure bloodline, no sickness, perfect health. Take her, and my debt to the syndicate is wiped clean. As we agreed." Geoffrey slowly turned his head. He looked at Chloe. He catalogued her trembling lips, the tear tracks on her cheeks, the sheer, paralyzing terror radiating off her in waves. He tilted his head, breathing in deeply through his nose. "Fear sours the blood, Richard," Geoffrey murmured, his voice laced with mild boredom. "It makes it taste like ash and copper. She is drowning in it. She would break within a week." Richard's face drained of color. No, she's strong. She's just nervous. Please, Mr. Vance, it's $20 million. She's worth that. I swear to you, she's worth it." "I do not deal in damaged goods," Geoffrey said softly. He stepped away from the fireplace. His dark eyes flicked toward the door, toward the crack, toward the shadow. Madison's heart stopped. She knew she was hidden. She knew it was completely dark in the hallway. But as Geoffrey's gaze locked onto the sliver of space where she stood, she felt a physical pressure against her chest, as if a heavy hand had been placed over her heart. "But I will not leave empty-handed," Geoffrey continued, his eyes never leaving the crack in the door. He raised a pale, ringed finger and pointed directly at the darkness. "No," Geoffrey said, his voice dropping an octave, vibrating with an ancient, terrifying authority. "I want that one." Richard spun around, confused, squinting into the gloom of the hallway. "Who? The maid?" "The sister," Geoffrey corrected, the corners of his lips twitching upward in the ghost of a smile. "Step into the light." The command wasn't a request. It was a physical compulsion. Madison's legs moved before her brain could process the danger. Her boots made a dull thud on the floorboards as she pushed the heavy mahogany door open and stepped into the yellow light of the study. She wore a baggy grey sweater. Her hands were stained with silver polish. Her hair was pulled back in a messy knot. She stood next to her angelic, trembling sister, looking like a stray dog next to a show pony. Richard let out a nervous, breathless laugh. "Mr. Vance, surely you jest. That is Madison. She's not part of the arrangement. She hasn't been prepared. She's practically wild." Geoffrey stepped closer to Madison. The 4 massive bodyguards in the room shifted, hands resting near their jacket lapels. But Geoffrey raised a hand, silencing them. He stopped inches from Madison. Up close, the cold radiating from him was intense. She could see the faint, bluish veins beneath the translucent porcelain of his skin. She didn't lower her eyes. She didn't tremble. She just stared back at him, her jaw set, a mixture of profound exhaustion and deep-seated defiance burning in her chest. Geoffrey leaned in, dipping his head toward the curve of her neck. He didn't touch her, but she felt the rush of cold air as he inhaled deeply. "No fear," Geoffrey whispered, his voice meant only for her. "Just anger. Spicy. Complex." He pulled back and looked at Richard. "The debt is cleared, Richard. I am taking Madison. 10 minutes." The bodyguard's voice was like grinding gravel. He stood in the doorway of Madison's bedroom, his massive frame blocking the only exit. He didn't look at her. His gaze was fixed straight ahead, an immovable object ensuring compliance. Madison didn't speak. Her mind was a static hiss of white noise. The transition from the invisible daughter to the sacrificial lamb had happened so fast it left her entirely unmoored. She moved mechanically, pulling a battered canvas duffel bag from the back of her closet. She didn't pack much. What did one pack to go live with the undead? The thought was so absurd, it almost elicited a hysterical laugh, but the tight, painful knot in her throat strangled the sound. She grabbed 3 pairs of jeans, a handful of plain shirts, her worn leather jacket, and a framed photograph of her mother, the only thing in this house that held any real value to her. Her mother had died when Madison was 10, before the debt, before the syndicate, before Richard's desperate gamble had ruined them all. She zipped the bag. 7 minutes. She walked past the open door of Chloe's room. Her younger sister was sitting on the edge of her perfectly made 4-poster bed, staring blankly at the wall. The ivory silk dress was pooled around her waist. She didn't look up as Madison passed. She didn't offer a word of thanks, or an apology, or a goodbye. The relief radiating from Chloe was a palpable, ugly thing in the air. Madison didn't blame her. Survival made monsters of them all. When Madison reached the bottom of the stairs, Richard was standing by the front door, wringing his hands. The 3 black Maybachs idled in the rain outside, their red tail lights bleeding into the puddles. "Madison," Richard started, his voice a pathetic whine. He reached a hand out toward her arm, but stopped short of touching her. "You have to understand, this is for the family. You're doing a great service. A noble thing." Madison stopped. She gripped the strap of her duffel bag so tightly her knuckles ached. She looked at her father, really looked at him. The man who had been willing to sell his favorite child to save his own skin, and who was now happily trading the spare to settle the bill. "Don't," Madison said. Her voice was flat, devoid of the tears Richard expected. "Don't dress this up as nobility, Dad. You sold me. We both know it. Just enjoy the house." She didn't wait for his reply. She pushed past him and walked out into the biting October storm. The rear door of the center Maybach was open, held by one of the stoic guards. Madison tossed her duffel bag onto the floorboard and slid into the cavernous interior. The heavy door closed behind her with a solid, definitive thud, sealing her in a world of dark leather and tinted glass. Geoffrey was sitting in the corner, a crystal tumbler of dark amber liquid resting in his long, pale fingers. He didn't look at her as the car slipped smoothly into gear and glided down the driveway, leaving her childhood home shrinking in the rearview mirror. The silence in the car was heavy, thick with unspoken questions. The only sound was the rhythmic slap of the windshield wipers and the low hum of the massive engine. Madison stared out the window at the dark, blurring trees. She expected to be terrified. She expected to be weeping. But the overriding emotion flooding her chest was a strange, hollow detachment. The worst had finally happened. The axe had fallen. There was a twisted kind of peace in the aftermath. "You aren't crying." His voice cut through the quiet, smooth and dangerously soft. Madison turned her head slowly. Geoffrey was looking at her now. The dim interior lights of the car cast sharp shadows across his cheekbones. His eyes were unreadable, ancient pools that seemed to draw all the light in the cabin towards them. "Would you like me to?" Madison asked, her tone sharper than she intended. The adrenaline was finally catching up to her, making her reckless. "I can probably force a few tears if it's required for the aesthetic." A flicker of genuine surprise crossed Geoffrey's face, followed instantly by the faintest hint of amusement. He took a slow sip from his tumbler. The liquid inside wasn't amber, she realized with a cold jolt. In the dim light, it was a deep, impossible crimson. "Most humans in your position are begging for their lives by now," Geoffrey observed, resting his wrist on his knee. "Or bargaining. Or vomiting." "My father already did the bargaining," Madison replied, leaning her head back against the soft leather headrest. and I have nothing left to lose. So why waste the energy crying over a deal that's already signed? Geoffrey studied her. His gaze felt physical, a cold weight moving over her face, cataloguing the dark circles under her eyes, the stubborn set of her jaw, the pulse beating rapidly but steadily at the base of her throat. "Your father offered me a porcelain doll," Geoffrey said quietly, the amusement fading from his voice, replaced by something heavier, something that made the hair on Madison's arms stand up. "He offered me something fragile, meant to be looked at and broken. I have no use for fragile things, Madison." He leaned forward slightly. The scent of him, cold ozone, crushed mint, and the sharp tang of copper washing over her. "I need something that can survive the dark," he murmured. "Welcome to the Syndicate." The motorcade didn't head toward the deep woods or some ancient, crumbling Gothic castle. Instead, it carved a brutal path straight into the glowing, pulsating heart of the city's financial district. Madison watched the towering monoliths of steel and glass swallow the night sky. The Maybach descended into a subterranean parking garage, slipping past 3 distinct security checkpoints before coming to a halt in a private, brightly lit bay. The transition from the car to the elevator was a blur of silent men and cold marble. Geoffrey walked ahead of her, his stride long and completely soundless. He didn't look back to see if she was following. The implication was clear. There was nowhere for her to run. The elevator had no buttons, only a biometric scanner that read Geoffrey's palm before rocketing upward with stomach-dropping speed. When the doors finally slid open, Madison stepped out, and the breath left her lungs. She had expected a dungeon. She walked into a museum. The penthouse spanned the entire top floor of the skyscraper. It was a masterpiece of brutalist architecture and modern design. Exposed dark steel beams, floor-to-ceiling windows, offering a dizzying 360-degree view of the city skyline, and vast expanses of polished black concrete. There was no dust. There was no decay. It was sterile, beautiful, and utterly devoid of life. "Silas!" Geoffrey called out, his voice carrying effortlessly across the cavernous living space. A man stepped out from the shadows near a massive, unlit fireplace. He was tall, lean, and wore a sharp grey suit. His eyes were a pale, unsettling silver, and his skin had the same unnatural perfection as Geoffrey's. "Sir," Silas said, bowing his head slightly. "Show Madison to the East Wing suite," Geoffrey commanded, unbuttoning his suit jacket. He finally turned to look at her, his dark eyes unreadable. "You will remain there for the evening. Food will be brought to you. Do not attempt to leave the floor. The security system is unforgiving." Without another word, Geoffrey turned and disappeared down a long, dark corridor. Madison stood in the center of the room, clutching her cheap duffel bag, feeling profoundly out of place. Silas walked toward her, his footsteps echoing softly. "If you would follow me, Miss Madison," Silas said. His voice was polite, but it held the distinct, mechanical edge of an automated recording. She followed him down a hallway, lined with abstract, disturbing art. The East Wing suite was larger than the entire first floor of her father's crumbling estate. It featured a massive, king-sized bed draped in dark linens, a sitting area with a velvet couch, and a wall of glass looking out over the glittering city below. "The bathroom is through there. The closet is stocked with necessities. If you require anything else, there is a tablet on the nightstand," Silas instructed, lingering in the doorway. Madison dropped her bag on the floor. She looked at the heavy oak door. "Is there a lock on the outside?" Silas smiled. It was a terrible, practiced expression. "There are no locks on the inside either. You are safe here, Madison, as long as you follow the rules." "And if I don't?" Then you will discover why your father was so terrified, Silas replied smoothly, before stepping back and closing the door softly behind him. Madison stood in the silence. The city below was a sprawling grid of golden light, but up here it was perfectly, oppressively quiet. She walked into the massive bathroom, gripped the edges of the marble sink, and finally let out a long, shaky breath. She stared at her reflection. She looked exhausted, pale, and entirely human. She turned on the cold water and splashed her face. She wasn't going to wait in this glass cage like a prized pet. She wasn't Chloe. Drying her face, Madison marched out of the bathroom, bypassed her duffel bag, and walked straight to the heavy oak door. She grabbed the handle and pulled. It opened. The penthouse was a labyrinth of shadows and moonlight. Madison moved silently, her socks gliding over the polished concrete floors. She wasn't trying to escape. Silas had made it clear that was impossible. She was hunting for answers. She found the study at the end of the north corridor. The double doors were slightly ajar, a warm, golden light spilling onto the floor. Unlike the rest of the sterile penthouse, this room smelled of old paper, leather, and something metallic and sharp. Madison pushed the door open. Jeffrey sat behind a massive mahogany desk, his jacket off, his sleeves rolled up, revealing pale forearms corded with lean muscle. Spread across the desk were dozens of financial documents, red-inked ledgers, and a glowing laptop screen. He didn't look up as she entered. "I told you to remain in your suite." "I'm not a dog, Jeffrey. I don't respond well to stay," Madison said, stepping fully into the room. Her heart was beating a frantic rhythm against her ribs, but she kept her voice entirely level. Jeffrey paused. He slowly lifted his head, his dark eyes locking onto hers. The sheer audacity of her presence seemed to intrigue him more than it angered him. He leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers. "You are trespassing in a predator's den, Madison. What is it you want?" "The truth," she demanded, crossing her arms over her faded sweater to hide a slight tremor. "My father owed you $20 million. Chloe was the payment. That was the deal. But you took me instead. You said you didn't want a porcelain doll. So, what do you want? If I'm not a blood bag, and I'm not a trophy, what am I?" A slow, chilling smile spread across Jeffrey's face. It was the first time she had seen a genuine expression on him, and it was entirely predatory. "Your father," Jeffrey began, his voice a low purr, "is a fool. But he is a thieving fool. The $20 million was not a loan, Madison. It was a laundering operation. He was cleaning syndicate money through his real estate holdings. But 3 months ago, he got greedy. He skimmed off the top, and worse, he stole a ledger." Madison's brow furrowed. "A ledger?" "A physical drive," Jeffrey corrected, tapping a pale finger against the desk. "It contains the daytime identities of the syndicate's top earners. It contains bank accounts, human aliases, offshore routing numbers. If that drive falls into the hands of a rival faction or the human authorities, the syndicate faces exposure." Madison stared at him, the pieces rapidly falling into place. "And you think Chloe couldn't help you find it?" "Chloe," Jeffrey scoffed softly, "would shatter the moment I raised my voice. She knows nothing of your father's business. She knows how to smile and pour tea." He stood up, moving around the desk with that fluid, terrifying grace. He stopped just a foot away from her. The temperature in the room plummeted. "But you, Madison," Jeffrey murmured, looking down at her. "You are the one who balanced the books when the accountants quit. You are the one who managed the estate when the electricity was threatened. You know your father's lies better than he does. You know his hiding spots, his safe houses." Madison held his gaze, refusing to back down, even as the cold radiating from him seeped into her skin. "You want me to hunt my own father?" "I want you to retrieve what is mine," Geoffrey corrected softly. "Your father offered me a toy. I took a weapon. Help me find the ledger, Madison. Navigate the daytime world for me. Read the human financial traps he set." "And if I do?" she asked, her voice a tight whisper. "What do I get out of it?" Geoffrey reached out, his cold knuckles barely brushing against the rough wool of her sweater. The touch sent a violent shockwave of electricity straight to her core. "If you succeed," Geoffrey said, his eyes darkening to pitch black, "I will give you the one thing your father never could. Absolute freedom." The dress was a weapon. It hung in the closet of the East Wing suite the next evening, a sleek, floor-length sheath of midnight blue velvet with a plunging neckline and a slit that rode dangerously high up the thigh. It wasn't frilly. It wasn't innocent. It was designed to draw blood. "We are attending a charity gala at the Sterling Foundation," Silas had informed her an hour prior, delivering a velvet box containing a diamond choker that felt heavier than a shackle. "Your father's associates will be there, you will observe. You will identify anyone acting erratically." Madison stared at herself in the floor-to-ceiling mirror. The girl in the baggy sweater was gone. Staring back was someone sharper, colder, someone who looked like she belonged to the king. When she stepped out into the main living area, Geoffrey was waiting. He wore a midnight blue tuxedo that perfectly matched her dress. It was a silent, undeniable claim of ownership. His eyes swept over her, a dark, consuming appraisal that made her breath catch. "You clean up well," was all he said, offering his arm. Madison took it. His forearm was like carved stone beneath the fabric of his suit. The gala was a sensory overload of crystal chandeliers, clinking champagne glasses, and the suffocating perfume of the ultra-rich. The Sterling Foundation was neutral ground, a place where high society humans rubbed shoulders with the hidden elite of the syndicate, blissfully unaware of the monsters in their midst. The moment Geoffrey and Madison entered the ballroom, the atmosphere shifted. Conversations died. Eyes darted toward them. Geoffrey Vance did not bring human companions to syndicate-monitored events unless they were food, and Madison did not look like prey. "Keep your head up," Geoffrey murmured, his lips barely moving as he guided her through the parting crowd. "They can smell hesitation." "I'm not hesitating," Madison replied evenly, her eyes scanning the room. She recognized several of her father's old golfing buddies, men who had stopped taking Richard's calls when the money ran dry. Before they could reach the private VIP tables, a woman stepped into their path. She was breathtaking, with hair the color of spun gold and eyes that glowed with a faint, unnatural amber light. She wore a crimson gown that looked suspiciously like spilled blood. "Geoffrey," the woman purred, her gaze sliding instantly to Madison with a look of pure, unadulterated contempt. "I heard you acquired Richard's debt, but I was told you were taking the pretty one. Did the blonde die of fright on the way over?" Geoffrey's grip on Madison's arm tightened slightly, a silent warning. "Ilara, you are blocking the walkway." Ilara didn't move. She stepped closer to Madison, her amber eyes flashing. "She smells like copper and cheap soap. Tell me, human, does your father know you're playing dress-up with the adults? Or did he just throw you to the wolves to save his own miserable skin?" The humans nearby subtly backed away, sensing the sudden drop in temperature. Madison felt a surge of pure, hot anger. It wasn't the trembling terror her sister would have shown. It was the rage of 3 years of humiliation, of being the discarded daughter, bubbling to the surface. She didn't look at Geoffrey for permission. She met Ilara's glowing eyes dead on. "My father," Madison said, her voice carrying clearly over the soft jazz playing in the background, is a coward who makes terrible investments. Much like your decision to short-sell the maritime shipping stocks last quarter, Elara. I saw the public filings. You lost what? 30 million in a week? Elara's face froze. The amber in her eyes flared into a violent, fiery red. The human financial markets were supposed to be a secret playground for the syndicate, not something a filthy human girl could openly mock. A low hiss escaped Elara's lips, and she lunged, her manicured hand blurring toward Madison's throat. Madison didn't flinch. Before Elara's fingers could even brush Madison's skin, Jeffrey moved. It was a terrifying display of apex speed. 1 second he was standing beside Madison. The next, his hand was clamped around Elara's throat, lifting the vampire entirely off the marble floor. The ballroom descended into absolute, terrified silence. Jeffrey didn't yell. He didn't bare his fangs. The sheer, suffocating aura of violence rolling off him was enough to crack the champagne flutes on the nearest table. "She is mine," Jeffrey said to the choking vampire, his voice a dark, echoing void that vibrated through the floorboards. "And if you ever look at her again, I will rip your heart out through your teeth. Do you understand?" Elara managed a frantic, gasping nod, her hands clawing desperately at Jeffrey's immovable grip. Jeffrey dropped her. Elara collapsed onto the floor, coughing violently, her crimson dress pooling around her like a wound. Jeffrey turned back to Madison, adjusting his cuffs with terrifying calm. He offered her his arm again, his dark eyes locked on hers, burning with an intense, proprietary fire. "Shall we get a drink?" he asked softly. Madison looked at the gasping vampire on the floor, then up at the king who had just violently claimed her in front of the entire underworld. Her heart was racing, not with fear, but with a dangerous, intoxicating thrill. She slipped her hand into the crook of his arm. "I'd love one." For 3 grueling weeks, the penthouse study became their war room. The initial thrill of the gala faded into the exhaustive, meticulous reality of forensic accounting. Madison lived in oversized sweaters and drank copious amounts of bitter black espresso, poring over mountains of Richard's encrypted files that Jeffrey's tech team had managed to clone from her father's home office. The dynamic between them had shifted subtly. The king of the syndicate no longer treated her as a prisoner to be monitored, but as an asset to be honed. Jeffrey would often stand by the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at the rain-slicked city streets, listening to Madison's muttering as she traced the labyrinth of her father's deceit. "He layered the offshore accounts," Madison said one evening, rubbing her exhausted eyes. The glow of the monitor cast long, harsh shadows across her pale face. 3 shell companies in the Caymans, standard evasion, but the transfers stopped making sense around mid-July. Jeffrey turned away from the window, his movements silent. He glided to the desk, leaning over her shoulder to look at the screen. The familiar scent of crushed mint and ozone washed over her, making the tiny hairs on the back of her neck stand at attention. He was standing close enough that she could feel the unnatural chill radiating from his tailored suit. "Show me," he murmured, his voice a dark, velvet rumble near her ear. Madison swallowed hard, forcing her focus back to the spreadsheet. "Right here. $50,000 funneled out of the primary holding company, but it doesn't go offshore. It routes through a domestic LLC registered in Delaware, then completely vanishes. No property acquisitions under that LLC. No payroll, no vendor payments. It's a dead end." Jeffrey's dark eyes narrowed. A dead end in digital terms, perhaps. But human currency must manifest physically, eventually. What is the name of the LLC? Silver Birch Holdings, Madison read, her brow furrowing. She tapped her pen against her chin, a habit she'd had since high school math class. Silver birch. Wait. She quickly opened a new window, bypassing the financial records and pulling up a digitized file of old family photographs her father had arrogantly left on his primary hard drive. She clicked frantically through albums of Chloe's beauty pageants, Richard's golf trips, and the opulent vacations Madison had never been invited on. She found what she was looking for in a folder labeled 1998. It was a picture of her mother, smiling radiantly, standing in front of a rustic, heavily wooded cabin. Behind her, the pale, peeling bark of massive silver birch trees framed the structure. My mother's family owned a hunting cabin in upstate New York, Madison said, her voice dropping to a whisper. When she died, the property supposedly went into a blind trust to be sold. Dad always told us it was liquidated to pay off her medical bills. But what if it wasn't? What if he kept it under a shell company? Jeffrey straightened up, his gaze locking onto the image of the isolated cabin. The woods around it looked deep, dark, and utterly secluded. The perfect place to hide from monsters. A physical location off the grid, Jeffrey analyzed, his tone completely flat, devoid of the excitement a human would show. But Madison had learned to read the micro-expressions of the predator, the slight tightening of his jaw, the fractional widening of his pupils. He was ready to strike. It wouldn't show up on his primary asset list, therefore my collectors wouldn't think to seize it. If he has the physical ledger drive, Madison said, looking up at Jeffrey, that's where it is. I'm sure of it. He wouldn't trust a safety deposit box. He's too paranoid. Pack a coat, Jeffrey said, turning toward the door. It gets cold in the mountains. You're taking me with you? Madison asked, surprised. I thought your men would handle the retrieval. Jeffrey paused in the doorway. He looked back at her, his expression unreadable, but there was a strange, heavy intensity in his dark eyes. You found the door, Madison. It is only fitting you are there when we kick it down. The flight upstate took less than 40 minutes in the syndicate's private helicopter. They landed in a clearing 5 miles from the property line, the brutal wash of the rotors tearing through the canopy of autumn leaves. From there, they drove a matte black SUV up a winding, treacherous logging road. Silas drove, his silver eyes constantly scanning the tree line, while Jeffrey and Madison sat in the spacious rear cabin. The silence between them was taut, vibrating with anticipation. Madison watched the trees close in around them as they ascended. The isolation of the place was suffocating. If things went wrong out here, there would be no witnesses, no help, just the ancient woods and the things that hunted in the dark. The SUV crunched to a halt behind a dense thicket of pines. The cabin was visible through the branches, a dark, brooding structure of logs and stone, completely unlit. No thermal signatures inside, Silas reported from the front seat, his voice mechanical. The perimeter appears secure. Stay close to me, Jeffrey instructed Madison, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. They exited the vehicle, the bitter mountain wind biting instantly through Madison's coat. Jeffrey didn't seem to notice the cold. He moved toward the cabin with predatory silence, his dark eyes analyzing every shadow. Silas flanked them, a heavy, matte black sidearm suddenly appearing in his hand. The front door of the cabin was secured with a heavy iron padlock. Jeffrey didn't bother looking for a key. He gripped the heavy metal lock with one pale hand and twisted. With a sickening sound of rending steel, the iron snapped like cheap plastic. He pushed the door open. The interior smelled of dust, pine needles, and stale air. It hadn't been lived in for months, but as Jeffrey's flashlight beam swept across the room, Madison saw the signs of recent, frantic habitation. A sleeping bag hastily rolled in the corner, empty tins of food, and against the far wall, hidden beneath a heavy woolen blanket, a modern, steel, biometric safe. "He was here," Madison breathed, staring at the safe. "But he's gone now." "He doesn't matter," Jeffrey said dismissively, walking toward the safe. "Only the ledger matters." He looked at the digital keypad on the heavy steel door. "A standard 10-digit interface, biometric override disabled. Can you open it, or do I need to tear it out of the wall and take it back to the city?" Madison stepped forward, pulling off her gloves. "If you tear it out, you risk triggering the internal thermite charge. Dad was paranoid about brute force. Let me try." She knelt in front of the cold steel box. Her father was a creature of habit. He thought he was clever, but his vanity made him predictable. He wouldn't use his own birthday. That was too obvious. He wouldn't use her mother's. He had erased her from his life years ago. She keyed in a sequence of numbers. 04121999. Chloe's birthday, the day the pretty one was born. The keypad beeped twice, a harsh, angry red flashing on the screen. "Access denied," Madison cursed under her breath. She had 2 tries left before the safe incinerated its contents. She stared at the numbers, her mind racing back through years of neglect, of watching her father prioritize appearances over substance. If it wasn't Chloe's birthday, what was the one number Richard valued above all else? What was the anchor of his entire hollow existence? The debt, Madison whispered to herself. She reached out and quickly typed the exact routing number of the syndicate's primary offshore holding account, the account into which her father had originally laundered the $20 million. A soft, pneumatic hiss filled the quiet cabin. The heavy steel door clicked and swung open a fraction of an inch. Madison let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding. She pulled the door wide. Inside, resting on a velvet tray, was a small, matte black, encrypted hard drive. She reached out to grab it, a surge of absolute triumph rushing through her veins. She had done it. She had secured her freedom. "Brilliant," a voice said from the darkness near the doorway. "Absolutely brilliant. I told Richard his discarded daughter was sharper than he gave her credit for." Madison froze. That wasn't Jeffrey's voice. She turned slowly. Silas stood near the broken front door, the heavy sidearm in his hand, no longer pointed at the tree line. It was pointed directly at Jeffrey's back. The silence that followed was absolute, heavier than the mountain air outside. Jeffrey didn't turn around. He remained perfectly still, his broad shoulders casting a terrifying silhouette in the dim beam of the flashlight resting on the floor. The temperature in the cabin didn't just drop, it plummeted, the moisture in the air crystallizing into a faint, frosty mist near the floorboards. "Silas," Jeffrey said. His voice wasn't angry. It was utterly, profoundly hollow, a void that promised total annihilation. "I apologize, sir," Silas replied, though his tone held a sickening layer of smug satisfaction. "But the old ways are dying. The syndicate needs a leader willing to embrace the modern era, not a relic clinging to shadows and outdated codes of honor." Madison clutched the hard drive to her chest, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Silas wasn't just a bodyguard. He was the traitor. The pieces violently rearranged themselves in her mind. "It wasn't just my father who skimmed the money," Madison said, her voice trembling slightly, but her eyes burning with sudden clarity. She looked at Silas. "You helped him. You gave him the access codes to steal the ledger. You wanted him to take the fall so you could usurp the throne." Silas offered a thin, cruel smile, his silver eyes flashing in the gloom. "A clever girl to the end." "Yes. Richard was a convenient idiot. I manipulated his financial panic, guided his hand to the ledger. With that drive, I can expose Jeffrey's loyalists to the human authorities, and buy the loyalty of the rival factions. The king falls, and a new board of directors takes over." "You are assuming," Geoffrey murmured, slowly turning to face his betrayer. "That you will leave this mountain." "I have a UV-laced hollow point aimed at your spine, Geoffrey," Silas countered, his hand remarkably steady. "And 36 mercenaries waiting at the bottom of the logging road. Your reign ends tonight. Madison, slide the drive across the floor. Now." Madison looked from the gun in Silas's hand to Geoffrey's impossibly calm face. The king didn't look at the weapon. He looked at her. His dark eyes held a silent command, a complex communication born of 3 weeks of shared silence and unspoken understanding. Do not submit. Madison didn't slide the drive. Instead, she gripped it tighter and took a deliberate step backward, positioning herself so the heavy steel door of the open safe was between her and Silas's line of sight. "I said slide it!" Silas barked, the veneer of politeness cracking. "If you shoot him, I'll smash the drive against the stone hearth," Madison threatened, her voice ringing out with a startling authority. "The casing is strong, but it won't survive a direct, repeated impact with river rock. You'll have nothing." Silas hesitated for a fraction of a second. His silver eyes darted from Geoffrey to Madison, calculating the risk. It was a fatal miscalculation. Geoffrey didn't move like a human. He moved like a shadow detached from the wall. The space between him and Silas vanished instantly. The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed cabin, a brilliant flash of blue-white UV light that illuminated the dust motes in the air. The bullet tore through the shoulder of Geoffrey's suit, the supernatural ultraviolet compound hissing violently as it burned the flesh beneath. But the apex predator didn't even flinch. Before Silas could adjust his aim for a second shot, Geoffrey's hand clamped down on the gun, crushing the steel barrel flat with a sickening crunch of metal. His other hand shot forward, grabbing Silas by the throat and lifting him effortlessly off the floorboards. "A relic?" Geoffrey whispered, his voice vibrating with a terrifying demonic resonance that shook the foundation of the cabin. His dark eyes bled into absolute, bottomless black. "Let me show you the old ways, Silas." The fight was brutal, silent, and incredibly fast. Silas was strong, thrashing wildly, his silver eyes wide with sudden, primal terror as he realized the sheer magnitude of the power gap between them. He managed to land a desperate, glancing blow to Geoffrey's ribs, a strike that would have shattered a human's ribcage. But Geoffrey barely swayed. Geoffrey threw Silas across the room. The traitor crashed through the heavy wooden dining table, splintering it into kindling. Silas scrambled backward, gasping, trying to draw a secondary weapon from his ankle holster. Madison watched the violence with wide eyes, the raw, unfiltered savagery of the vampire world fully exposed. She wasn't helpless, though. She saw Silas reaching for the backup weapon. Without thinking, Madison grabbed the heavy iron flashlight from the floor. She didn't throw it. She rushed forward, closing the distance while Silas was focused on the approaching king, and swung the heavy iron cylinder down with all her strength onto Silas's wrist. Bone snapped loudly. Silas let out a ragged shriek, dropping the silver-plated dagger he had just unholstered. Geoffrey stopped it. He looked at Madison, who was standing over the bleeding traitor, breathing heavily, the heavy iron flashlight gripped tightly in her hands. She looked wild, terrified, and utterly magnificent. Geoffrey stepped over the wreckage of the table. He looked down at his former second-in-command. "You relied on human weapons and human greed," Geoffrey said coldly. "You forgot what we are." He didn't draw out the execution. With a swift, merciless twist of his wrist, Geoffrey snapped Silas's neck. The crack echoed sharply, and the traitor's body slumped to the floor, lifeless. The silence rushed back into the cabin, heavy and oppressive. Geoffrey stood amidst the wreckage, his chest heaving slightly. The UV burn on his shoulder was smoking, a nasty, jagged tear in his pristine suit and the pale flesh beneath. But he ignored the wound, turning slowly to face Madison. She stood frozen, the hard drive clutched in one hand, the iron flashlight in the other. She had just assaulted a vampire. She had stepped into the middle of an apex predator's execution. Jeffrey walked slowly toward her. He reached out, gently taking the heavy flashlight from her trembling fingers and tossing it aside. Then, his cold, pale hand cupped her cheek. The contrast between his icy skin and the flushed heat of her face was extreme. "You didn't run," Jeffrey murmured, his thumb lightly brushing across her cheekbone. "I told you," Madison whispered, her voice barely working, staring up into the dark, impossible depths of his eyes. "I don't respond well to stay or run." A genuine, breathtaking smile broke across Jeffrey's face, illuminating the stark marble of his features. "I am beginning to realize that, Madison. Come, let us go home." The penthouse was silent when they returned. The mercenaries at the bottom of the mountain road had scattered the moment they realized Silas was dead, their loyalty bought only by the promise of easy money, not the reality of facing Jeffrey Vance's wrath. Madison sat on the edge of the velvet couch in the main living area, watching as Jeffrey shed his ruined suit jacket. He poured a glass of the deep crimson liquid from his crystal decanter, drinking it down in one slow, deliberate motion. As she watched, the angry, smoking burn on his shoulder began to slowly, unnaturally knit itself back together. She set the encrypted hard drive on the heavy glass coffee table. It looked impossibly small to hold the fate of an entire underworld empire. "Your throne is secure," Madison said quietly, breaking the heavy silence. "The traitors will panic without Silas. The drive is yours." Jeffrey set the empty glass down. He walked around the table and sat in the leather armchair opposite her. He looked at the drive, then up at her. The predatory edge was gone from his gaze, replaced by something heavier, something profoundly serious. "You fulfilled your end of the bargain," Jeffrey stated. His voice was formal, devoid of its usual melodic hum. He reached beneath the table and pulled out a sleek, black aluminum briefcase. He placed it next to the hard drive and popped the latches. The lid swung open to reveal neat stacks of banded $100 bills and a thick manila envelope resting on top. $5 million in untraceable human currency, Jeffrey listed smoothly. The envelope contains a new passport, a new social security number, and the deed to a secluded villa in the south of France, under the name Vivienne Laurent. It is completely insulated from the syndicate. Your father will never find you. I will never find you. Madison stared at the briefcase. It was everything she had ever dreamed of during those long, freezing nights in the crumbling west wing of her father's estate. It was escape. It was absolute, undeniable freedom. No more mending Chloe's dresses, no more balancing Richard's impossible ledgers, no more living in the shadow of monsters. She reached out, her fingers brushing the edge of the manila envelope. The paper was crisp, cool. "Why so much?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "You promised me freedom. A bus ticket and a fake ID would have accomplished that." Jeffrey leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, steepling his long fingers. "Because you are not a pawn, Madison. You navigated my world. You outsmarted a traitor. You stood your ground in a room full of apex predators. You earned a queen's ransom." She looked at him. The king of the syndicate. Terrifying, cold, immortal. Yet in the past 3 weeks, he had shown her more respect, more genuine recognition of her worth than her own human father had in 20 years. Richard had looked at her and seen a spare part. Jeffrey had looked at her and seen a weapon. Madison slowly pulled her hand back from the briefcase. She looked around the cavernous, beautiful, utterly silent penthouse. The glass cage. "If I take this," Madison said, meeting his dark eyes directly, "I go back to being a human. I go back to hiding, to worrying about taxes and mundane, fragile things. I go back to the light." "Yes," Geoffrey said softly. The single word sounded almost painful. "And if I stay?" she challenged, her heart beginning to hammer, a frantic, thrilling rhythm against her ribs. Geoffrey froze. The air in the room seemed to stand perfectly still. He looked at her, truly looked at her, his eyes searching her face for any sign of fear, any hint of hesitation. He found none. He found only the same dark, spicy defiance that had drawn his attention in her father's study. "If you stay," Geoffrey said, his voice dropping an octave, vibrating with an ancient, terrifying promise, "there is no going back. You will walk in the dark. You will sit at my right hand. You will not be a captive, Madison. You will be my partner, my equal in all things that matter." Madison looked at the briefcase full of cash. It represented a safe, quiet, invisible life. Then she looked at the hard drive. It represented power, danger, and control over the very monsters that had ruined her family. She reached out. She didn't touch the money. She didn't touch the passport. Madison picked up the encrypted hard drive. She held it out to Geoffrey, her chin raised, her dark eyes flashing with absolute, terrifying resolve. "Keep the money, Geoffrey," Madison said, a slow, sharp smile curving her lips. "I think I prefer the architecture of the dark." Geoffrey reached out, his cold fingers brushing against hers as he took the drive. The touch sent a familiar, electric shockwave through her system. But this time she didn't flinch. The Vampire King smiled back, and for the first time in his long, immortal existence, he looked entirely, devastatingly human. Sometimes the world tells you exactly what your value is. It tells you that you are the spare, the background character, the rejected sister meant to mend the seams of someone else's beautiful life. But true power rarely wears a silk dress. True power survives the cold, learns the rules of the dark, and refuses to flinch when the monsters bare their teeth. Madison's father tried to pay his debts with perfection, completely unaware that he had offered the king a forged blade instead of a fragile doll. If you enjoyed this descent into the dark, twisted romance of Madison and the Vampire King, please hit that like button, share the story with your fellow dark fiction lovers, and subscribe for more tales of suspense, betrayal, and unpredictable twists.